Welcome to the channel. Today's story is from February 1978. Winter in the Plumas mountains always breathed with a special cold, the kind that crawls under your skin, penetrates your muscles, bends your fingers, and makes your heart beat a little faster than it should. But late February was especially brutal. The wind carried snow not in flakes, but in ragged shreds, as if tearing them directly from the clouds, throwing them down with merciless force. The ground was hidden beneath a thick layer of white heaviness that swallowed sound, time, and direction. This silence. It was so dense that it turned any movement into a crime against a world that wanted to remain motionless. Even cars driving on the highway at the foothills seemed like aliens disturbing the peace of the ancient, indifferent space. Only rare animals crossed the snow-covered trails, leaving tracks behind that vanished within minutes. And higher up, at an elevation where the road turned into an icy thread stretched between ancient pines, where twisted branches reached toward the sky like broken fingers, where every shadow seemed alive, their night fell especially sharply. It seemed to drop from the sky like a single heavy slab, covering everything that had been visible a minute before. And on this night, when the darkness seemed liquid and viscous, Joseph Sean's old van stopped forever. It stopped with a muffled, treacherous cough from the engine, short, hoarse, like the last breath of an exhausted beast. And this sound immediately drowned in the snowfall, as if the mountain itself wanted not only to take away movement but also to erase its memory. Sean's was not a man who panicked. But when the car gave up, when the metal cooled under his gloves, and the engine no longer responded with even a faint promise of life, when the silence around became palpably hostile, he realized that the problem was more serious than he had thought. He tried to get out. He tried to push the car, its front wheels buried in the loose snow. He tried to coax it back to life. His feet slowly sank, as if the ground beneath him was also trying to drag him down into its own darkness. He braced his hands against the cold hood, strained, and a sharp, merciless pain pierced his chest. It struck like a red-hot hook plunged beneath his ribs. The world tilted. The sound of his breath became thin, like a torn thread. His heart squeezed, as if someone's hand had gripped it, unwilling to let go. This was the moment when a person understands that there is no one around. That the cold could kill. That time was an enemy. That the night was coming alive. And that he was utterly alone here. He returned to the car, breathing heavily. It wasn't warmer inside, but at least the cabin walls offered an illusion of protection, flimsy, almost mocking. The wind outside the window hurled snow against the glass, as if trying to break inside. The air grew denser. Painfully silent. And suddenly, in this viscous, muffled emptiness, a light appeared. Headlights. Real headlights, cutting through the night. They moved slowly, as if probing the road. The beams trembled, as if the car was being driven by someone who himself feared the night. But they were getting closer. They were real. This was a chance, salvation, a way out. The headlights were almost there when something strange happened, too strange for an ordinary road. They slowed down. Became almost motionless. And behind them, against the snow, shadows appeared. Several. They moved unevenly, as if gliding. No footsteps, no sound. Only shadows. From their movement, a cold ran down Sean's spine, unlike the winter chill. This was the cold that is born within human instinct, when one realizes, something in the darkness is not what it seems. He tried to signal. His heart was tearing with pain, but he raised his hand. He tried to scream. But at that very moment, suddenly, sharply, as if someone had cut a cable, the headlights vanished. As if they were torn from reality. Not dimmed. Not flickering. But specifically cut off. And darkness crashed down again, dense, heavy, almost aggressive. Sean's lay motionless, trying to understand what had happened. His brain refused to work. He waited for the light to return. For the shadows to reappear. For at least something to give a sign. But there was only night all around. That very night, which seemed to watch his every breath. He didn't know how much time had passed, a minute or an hour, when a new flicker appeared far ahead. This time, not headlights. Small, trembling, pinpoint lights. Flashlights. Several of them. They moved as if someone was searching for something in the snow, or someone. But these lights moved too synchronously. Too quietly. Too confidently. As if those holding them knew this night far better than he did. He tried to signal again. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but hope pushed him forward, forcing him to try. But hardly had he strained his voice, hardly had his call broken into the cold air, all the lights froze simultaneously. And then, they went out. All at once. Just as suddenly as the headlights had vanished before. As if the night was putting out the lights on purpose. As if someone didn't want him to be seen. And at this moment, fear fully penetrated him. No animal moves with a light like that. No tourists turn off flashlights simultaneously. No people disappear from sight so abruptly. He suddenly realized, whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. Or, they didn't want him to be noticed. The hours stretched unbearably. His heart pounded dully, with pain. And when the first faint streak of dawn touched the tops of the pines, the world around him seemed to return to the usual cruelty of winter, not the darkness that lived in the night. The pain subsided enough for him to get out of the car. He leaned on a tree, breathing heavily, but kept going. Every step was difficult. The snow crunched under his feet, as if resisting. The road stretched on, endlessly gray-white, harsh, indomitable. And it was then, amidst the morning silence and cold rays of light, that he saw it, standing to the side, covered in frost, but almost untouched. A turquoise 1969 Mercury Montego. Solid, wide, gleaming under the snow, like a relic that the night had decided to leave behind. It stood too perfectly. As if someone had placed it carefully, intentionally. As if those who had arrived knew they wouldn't return. There was no one inside. There were no tracks around either, the fresh snow had covered them. But in Sean's chest, where only fear had lived during the night, something even scarier now appeared, the feeling that he had already seen those who had exited this car. In that night. In that light. In those shadows. And that they had gone somewhere unknown. But they hadn't left the way ordinary people leave. The snow settled on the roof of the abandoned car evenly, almost gently, as if trying to hide it from prying eyes. As if the mountain itself wished not to reveal what had happened during the night. As if it wanted to cover the tracks, erase history, hide what should not be found by man. The car was parked too perfectly. Too neatly. Too confidently. Cars aren't parked like that when people are escaping. Cars are parked like that when people arrive where their presence is already expected. Sean's looked at the turquoise Mercury Montego for a long, viscous minute. The car seemed alien. Not just abandoned, but abandoned too calmly. Inside him, scenes of the night surfaced, trembling headlights, disappearing light, impossible silence, strange shadows that seemed to float in the snow. He tried to convince himself that all of it was a product of pain, fear, a cardiac spasm. But every cell in his body said otherwise. He saw people. Or what looked like people. And there were several of them. Their gait was wrong, too fluid, too quiet, as if the snow beneath them didn't exist. They turned off the lights. They moved synchronously, as if they knew he was watching them. A chill ran under his skin from that thought, having nothing in common with the February wind. A day later, when his health allowed him to speak, Sean's told about the car. And also, about the night lights. But no one took it seriously. Doctors attributed everything to pain, hunger, and fear. And the police decided he had simply become disoriented because the night could distort the perception of distance. But as soon as the investigators saw the Mercury Montego, this theory collapsed. Because the car belonged to a group of 5 men, who had gone missing on their way home. 5 adults who were driving south on the highway, but somehow ended up deep in the mountains, where the road turned into a white web leading to a place no one drove to without reason. And now the attention of the entire district was drawn not just to the disappearance of people, but to the fact that their last stop was in a place where it made no sense to stop. People who knew the road claimed that even locals didn't venture up this mountain stretch in winter. There are no shelters there. No communication. No chance of getting out in a blizzard. Yet these 5, for unknown reasons, drove there at night. But the strangest part was yet to come. The first police officers who arrived at the car were struck not by its appearance, but by its condition. On such a road, the undercarriage of a car should have been literally gouged by rocks, frozen ruts, and sharp tree debris. But there wasn't a single scratch under the Mercury. It was as if it had been placed there, not by driving on the road, but by being transported. And this was not a medical delusion. Not a nocturnal fear. Not a hallucination. It was a fact. A fact that didn't fit into any rational picture. Another fact shattered any explanations. The fuel level indicated that the car hadn't spun its wheels, hadn't accelerated, hadn't tried to get out. It had been placed and abandoned. Neatly. Tidy. Almost ceremonially. Why? What for? Who does that? Inside the car, there was a strange feeling, as if the air was lifeless. As if the internal silence had absorbed something extra. Sweets, papers, receipts were left in the glove compartment. The seats were dry. The driver's window was slightly open. The heating was off. There were no keys anywhere. There were also no signs of panic, nothing broken, torn, or hastily discarded. But there was one thing, a feeling as if the people had exited the car with deliberate calm. Without haste. Without a struggle. Without any attempt to return. They had gone into the night. Into a night where the light faded on its own. Into a night where shadows moved without steps. Into a night where every second seemed like a drawn-out time loop. The police inspected the surroundings. But snow had been falling all this time, destroying tracks, as if something up there wanted to conceal every movement of the 5. There were no tracks, neither deep, nor superficial, nor confused ones. And only the wind wrapped its cold fingers around the trees, whispering about something that was impossible to hear unless one stood there in the middle of the night. Sean's, learning that the car belonged to the missing men, fell silent. He no longer wanted to talk about the lights. About the shadows. About the figures. About the terrible moment when everything vanished at once. He understood, if these were the missing men, why did they turn off the lights? Why didn't they respond? Why did they move so quietly? But even more terrifying was something else. If it wasn't them, then who was standing in that night, just a few steps away from him? Who? When news of the disappearance spread throughout the district, the men's families were in shock. Not one of the missing men was prone to adventures. Not one had ever wandered in the mountains. Not one had a reason to drive there at night. Their route should have been direct and simple. No forks leading into the wilderness. Only the road home. But instead, 5 people vanished as if dissolved into the frosty air. The police organized a search. Hundreds of people scoured the slopes, the tree lanes. But every night, the forest covered all tracks with snow. The mountains seemed to push people away, unwilling to reveal the night's secret. And anxiety began to grow in society. Newspapers wrote about the strange route, about Sean's mysterious engine failure, about the night lights. Journalists hinted that what had happened might not just be an accident. However, real panic began later, when searchers managed to find tracks that led not to salvation, but to true horror. On the 6th day of the search, the fog began to settle towards the ground. It crept along the slopes, covered the trees, crawled into ravines and narrow gorges, like a living creature choosing where to leave tracks and where to erase them. People who went out for the search in the morning spoke of a strange feeling, as if the mountain was watching them. Too intently. Too consciously. Something in the air didn't match up with either experience or common sense. Mountains are usually indifferent. But this one behaved as if it was observing. And it was on this day that the searchers saw something that couldn't be explained by logic, nature, or the traces of human panic. Closer to noon, a group of volunteers ascended the slope to a barely visible trail. It wasn't completely snow-covered, the wind here blew differently, swirling currents so that the snow lay roughly, leaving clear spots. And it was on this strip of land, as if left specially, that they found footprints. But not of 5 people. Not of one. Only of one. One person was walking where no one would ever go without extreme necessity. The tracks led up the slope, towards an abandoned forest house, an old caretaker's cabin, forgotten decades ago. But the point wasn't that the tracks led towards the cabin, that could still be explained by despair or the search for shelter. More terrifying was that the steps were identical. Each imprint was precise. Identical depth. Identical stride length. Identical angle of the boot's sole. As if the person who left them was completely devoid of emotion. Devoid of fear. Devoid of consciousness. As if they weren't walking of their own free will. Every experienced tracker agreed on one thing. The person who left them moved, too evenly, as if on autopilot, as if their body had stopped reacting to heat, wind, fatigue. But even more impossible was that the tracks began right in the middle of a deeply packed layer of snow. There were no approach tracks. No tracks nearby. No tracks behind. Where logic demanded to see dozens of blurred imprints, there was only an ideal starting point, as if the person had appeared in that spot from emptiness. The rising wind swirled snow around the tracks. It didn't sweep them away, as if it had no power over them. But around them, on the contrary, the snow spun faster, as if unwilling to touch these imprints, as if it feared them. The searchers stood for a long time. People exchanged glances, but no one uttered a word. Though everyone thought the same thing, this isn't normal. This doesn't happen like this. It's impossible. The tracks led to the cabin. And everything would have looked like the usual path of a desperate person, if not for the silence. The silence was unnatural, thick, viscous, almost tactile. Normally in these places, one could hear the crunch of branches, the chirping of insects, the rustle of the wind. But now, nothing. Even the snow seemed soundless, as if its fall had been muffled. The closer the searchers got to the old cabin, the stronger grew the feeling that the air around them was heavy. It pressed against their chests, squeezed their temples, as if an invisible pressure was forcing their bodies to resist the very act of approaching. One of the rescuers later confessed that for a second he felt, if he got closer, something inside him would break. As if inside the cabin there was something that should not be discovered by humans. That cabin stood among the trees, like a remnant of a past that the mountain itself tried to forget. The door was locked, clad in rusty iron. The windows were boarded up. The snow on the roof lay too evenly, as if there wasn't a single vibration, not a single sound that could disturb the dark emptiness inside. The tracks approached the door. And vanished. There were no steps to the side. No signs of turning around. No return. Where the soles left the last imprint, the path ended. As if the person either went inside, or ceased to exist at the spot where the track stopped. The rescuers didn't know what to do. Not one dared to touch the door. Not one wanted to check what might be inside. The snow intensified. The fog thickened. The silence became unbearable. Until finally someone noticed one more detail. At the last boot print, the snow around it was cleared in a small circle. Very neat. As if someone's fingers, someone's long, cold fingers, had brushed the surface a couple of times, removing the excess. This was not the work of the wind. Not the work of a human. Not a random pattern. It was a movement, made before the track ended. But whose movement, whose? The searchers decided to open the door. They couldn't do otherwise, duty demanded an answer. But the fraction of a second when the lock gave a faint metallic sound was like a jolt to the nerves. As if an invisible world held its breath. When the door slowly, stiffly lifted open, nothing was visible in the opening. But there was a feeling that inside, someone was there. Not human. Not beast. Not alive. Not dead. Something. And this something had been there before humans. Much earlier. And it had woken up. The investigators froze, feeling how the cold from inside the cabin didn't just emerge, but drew warmth from their bodies, from their hands, from their thoughts. As if the darkness itself inside the building was alive. As if it was observing. Inside, there were no people. No bodies. No blood. No signs of a struggle. But there was something more terrifying, perfect cleanliness. An empty room where there wasn't even dust. As if something had recently been there that left no material traces behind. And only one thing disturbed this sterile emptiness. On the floor lay a thin layer of frost that formed a pattern. Not random. Not chaotic. A pattern in the form of 5 diverging lines, leading to different corners of the room and converging at a single point in the middle. 5 lines. 5 people. 5 missing men. And in the center, a circle, where it seemed something had been placed. Or someone had stood. The searchers stood silently. They didn't understand what the pattern meant. But they understood something else. This cabin was not a place of rescue. It was a place of presence. An alien, cold, impossible presence. And the longer they stayed inside, the stronger they felt that the mountain didn't want them to remain there. As if the air pressed down on them, pushing them towards the exit. When the rescuers stepped back onto the snow, someone from behind looked back, and saw that the frost was slowly disappearing. As if it understood that the people had left, and concealed its outlines back into the floorboards. That day, the group returned to base already after sunset. But everyone who had been at the cabin felt the same thing, they had come close to an explanation. But only enough to understand that the real mystery hadn't even begun. Because ahead of them awaited something that would make nature itself retreat. Something that would remain in reports as an unexplained phenomenon. Something that would become the most terrifying discovery in the entire history of the disappearance of the 5. After the discovery near the cabin, the general mood of the search party changed. It was visible in their gait, in their faces, in how people held their flashlights. As if everyone felt, the mountain was watching. As if it was waiting, biding its time, testing the limits of human presence. No one spoke about it aloud, but everyone felt it. And with each passing day, it became clearer, the car was merely a door to this nightmare. The cabin, merely its shadow. The horror itself was somewhere further, deeper in the forest, where the snow lay strangely, as if drawing patterns on the ground, created not by wind, not by animals, not by humans. On the 8th day of the search operation, one of the volunteers noticed something strange. Insignificant. But it made something inside the others clench. Not far from the cabin, where strange solitary traces led, the snow in one area lay differently than everywhere else. Everything around was soft, loose, uneven, as it always is on slopes. But one narrow corridor of snow ahead was perfectly dense, as if compacted by a heavy press. And along the length of the corridor, strange indentations. Not footsteps. Not irregularities. Not animals. But rather microscopic, thin depressions, repeating each other, creating a rhythm. A rhythm that a human could not leave. An animal could not leave. A mechanism could not leave. It looked like a trace from something that slid across the snow. But it didn't slide like skis, too narrow. And not like a sled, too even. And not like an ice slab, too directed. The trace was purposeful. It led somewhere. It called. It pulled. And the searchers, even those who had lived their whole lives in these mountains, looked at it, experiencing primal fear. The fear that they were not just seeing a phenomenon, they were seeing behavior. The behavior of snow that moved not by the action of nature, but by the action of something alive. They followed this strange narrow trace. It stretched for about 100 meters, then sharply turned right, as if something on the slope had pivoted, too sharply, too confidently. And in that turn, there was something that made the neck muscles involuntarily rise, like an animal hearing a predator. There was a sharp cut, a break, an instantaneous change of direction, as if something was constantly accelerating, moving deeper into the forest. And after a few minutes, everyone noticed another fact: the air around them had become denser. Much denser. The feeling was as if an invisible mass was pressing on their lungs. No matter how one breathed, the inhale became harder, the exhale, shorter. The forest seemed to slow down the processes of life. This trace led them to a ravine. Deep. Dark. Choked with branches, roots, ice blocks. And it was in this ravine that the searchers discovered the first body. But not human. The body of a small deer. Recently deceased. But not torn apart, not mangled, frozen solid to absolute immobility, like a glass figurine frozen in motion. Its fur was covered with the finest layer of hoarfrost. Its eyelashes, like glass needles. Its eyes, not cloudy, not dead, but transparent, like pieces of ice. It lay as if alive. As if it had simply been turned off. There were no signs of a struggle nearby. There were no traces of a predator. No blood. But there was a strange detail. On the snow around the body, a circle appeared, thin, almost mathematically perfect. Not a path. Not a snowdrift. Not wind. The circle was too perfect to be natural. Too precise. Too calibrated. And this circle was warm. The snow inside the circle was melting. Although the temperature was below freezing. Although everything around was covered in hoarfrost. But inside, the snow slowly receded, as if the ground from within was breathing. A chill ran through the search party so starkly that it seemed, the standing deer would come alive any second. One of the women took a step back and almost fell, because at that moment she heard a sound. Unknown. Unlike wind, or the creak of a tree, or an animal. The sound was like a thin ice sheet slowly cracking. But the cracking didn't come from the direction of the ravine. It came from underground. It grew stronger. It approached. It seemed to crawl. And the snow around the circle suddenly began to vibrate. Barely perceptibly, like the trembling of spiderweb threads. The searchers retreated. Not according to instructions. Not in coordination. Not as a group. But as people who understood, they were seeing something incommensurable with nature. They were seeing traces of a force not meant for human comprehension. The trembling subsided. The circle melted. But the air around became such that it was impossible to stay there long. And they returned. But the most terrifying thing awaited them not in the forest, but at the base. When they returned, the search coordinator noticed that all who had been near the ravine had hoarfrost appear on their jackets, but not random. It formed patterns. The patterns were similar to the lines in the cabin. 5 lines converging to the center. 5 rays. 5 directions. As if something had marked their presence. As if the mountain was watching. As if the line extending from the vanished deer now stretched towards them. But this was only the beginning. Because the next morning, snow had receded from several areas of the forest faster than it should have, as if it had been melted. And beneath this melted snow, the searchers found what became the most disturbing discovery of the entire search period. They found 5 new tracks. Of 5 different people. But these tracks were not fresh. And not ordinary. They were beneath snow that shouldn't have melted. Beneath a layer no one had touched. They were too deep, too even, too regular, as if left by 5 people who walked somewhere, not yielding to fear, not trying to return, not understanding what they were doing. And the most terrifying thing, all 5 tracks led to a single point, to where no path led. To where the snow lay as if something was hidden behind it. As if another road began there. And this road did not lead back. At dawn the next day, the mountain seemed to have changed. Not noticeably, not sharply, but in such a way that anyone who lived in a forested area would have felt it. The light had changed. The shadows grew thicker. The snow, denser. The air, heavier, as if imbued with something old, oppressive, ancient. And it was at this very moment, when a person feels small before what they don't understand, that the searchers saw something strange. 5 tracks, found under suddenly melted snow, led into a zone that wasn't on the map. Not because it had been removed. Not because it was forgotten. But because this zone was changing. Everyone who stood before this area felt one thing, ahead, not just a forest. Ahead, a space that didn't want to be found. A zone hidden not by distance, but by an impression, as if reality itself there became thinner, fractured, folding in on itself. The 5 tracks were completely different in size, but identical in direction. Almost perfectly linear. Without deviations. Without panic. Without attempts to veer off. People who are freezing don't walk like that. People lost in the forest don't walk like that. People who want to escape don't walk like that. That's how people walk who are following something they didn't choose. The tracks seemed fresh. But they couldn't be fresh, since it had snowed all night. The layer was thick, solid, dense. The tracks should have disappeared. But they remained. As if the snow didn't fall on the tracks. But the tracks, on the snow. The searchers stood for a long time, not daring to take a step. There was no order to enter there. But there was a feeling that if they left, the zone would move closer. As if it was waiting for an observer. Waiting for a victim. Waiting for a step forward. And then the group leader said, "We need to at least mark the boundary to understand if this is a perception error or something worse." They placed a wooden stake. An ordinary, roughly hewn one. But as soon as they stuck it into the ground, something happened. The stake disappeared. It didn't sink into the snow. It didn't fall. It didn't break. It just vanished, as if it had never been there. As if it entered the air like a liquid, went into the depths, dissolved into a layer of space that wasn't real. Everyone gasped. But the second stake behaved differently. It remained. It stood in place, as if nothing had happened. 2 identical objects, 2 different results. This isn't nature. This isn't a coincidence. This was a choice. An alien choice. Inhuman. Made by someone or something that watches unseen. The deeper the group advanced beyond the zone's limit, the stronger the feeling became that space was changing. At first, barely. Then, stronger. And then, sharply. The path ahead seemed to stretch longer. Steps sounded duller. Trees stood a little more unnaturally, too straight, too even, too identical, as if they had grown overnight by an unknown command. Sounds vanished completely. Even hearts beat as if without an echo. One tree particularly stood out in its form. It was thin, almost sickly. Without branches. Without bark. A straight, perfect, white trunk. It couldn't have grown here. Not in this temperature. Not with this species of trees. Not at this altitude. It wasn't a tree. It was something else. Something pretending to be a tree. Something stony, icy, motionless, but not alive. One searcher approached closer. He didn't touch. He only watched. And at that moment, the air around the tree bent. As if the space holding the forest's form had blinked. For a fraction of a second. For an instant. For one inhuman breath. And everyone saw that the tree was a landmark. A marker. A beacon. A boundary. The point that the 5 missing had seen and moved past. As the searchers moved further along the tracks, they noticed that the snow no longer crunched underfoot. It was as if it was listening. Attending. Remembering. And the tracks, 5 precise steps, led into a forest fissure, a narrow corridor between trees that hadn't been there yesterday. It had appeared overnight. And it was so even that it resembled a mine entrance. An entrance that couldn't be natural. And a strange smell. The smell wasn't forest-like. Not snowy. It was faint, metallic, cold, like the smell of old iron that has lain in darkness for hundreds of years. Somewhere in the distance, a sound rang out. Not loud. Not frightening. But impossible. The sound of a step. But not human. Not animal. A step, as if made by something without weight. Without form. Without a body. A step that leaves no tracks, but reverberates in a person's bones. And then one of the searchers saw it first, on a branch, in the shadows, where the flashlight's beam barely touched the trunks. Stood a round imprint of frost in the air. Not on the tree. As if something had touched space. As if an invisible entity had a touch. And this imprint cracked, like ice. And the sound was quiet and deadly. All 5 missing individuals, apparently, had gone further. Gone to where the tracks could no longer be human. Gone to where space began to grow dim. Gone to where the map ceased to exist. And the searchers stood and understood. If they took another step, their return would be impossible. Just as there was no return for those 5 men. Just as there would be no return for anyone who crossed the zone's boundary. And the mountain seemed to be waiting. Watching. Biding its time. Observing. Snow was falling. And each new snowflake fell slower than usual, as if it, too, was listening. And at that moment, one of the searchers noticed the most terrifying thing: the tracks of the 5 people no longer led forward. They led downward. Downward, beneath the snow. Beneath the ground. Into a depth that couldn't exist in these forests. Into a space that doesn't exist. But it was there. And it called. The tracks of the 5 missing men didn't just lead down. They led into a thin rift between worlds, where snow and earth merged into one, where the forest ceased to be a forest, and space. The searchers froze. Even their breath felt alien. Even the light from their flashlights, familiar and reliable, trembled. And then they heard it. A subtle, barely perceptible sound. Not the creak of branches. Not the snap of wood. Rather, the very breathing of the mountain. The sounds didn't come from the outside world. They emanated from within. From the very soil. From air that didn't breathe. From snow that didn't fall. And on each face appeared the realization, here, man doesn't control the steps. And then, the first scream. It was simultaneously inside and out. It was past and present. It was the 5 men they were looking for and those who would never return. The snow cracked beneath their feet. Slowly, gradually. One of the searchers saw movement, a thin silhouette between the trees, which couldn't be called human. It was too tall. Too thin. Too still. And yet, it trembled. It trembled all over, as if reading human fear. The next moments became chaos. The flashlight beams crackled like lines of ice. The snow underfoot swayed as if it were liquid. And every breath was an effort, as if the air itself resisted their presence. And then they understood the most horrifying thing: the tracks of the missing didn't lead to a safe cabin. They led to the center of the mountain. There, where space was compressed, where past and future were intertwined. There, where every step was a matter of life and death. And then the impossible happened. The snow behind them abruptly collapsed. Not an avalanche. But as if the mountain itself had closed a door that had vanished behind them. The way back disappeared. The air grew denser. The darkness deepened. And now every shadow, every sound, every shape around them, was hostile. And the searchers felt, the mountain was gathering their attention, drawing out thought, squeezing out fear. Every breath, pain. Every movement, effort. Every second, an eternity. And at the moment when it seemed they couldn't go on, one of the flashlights illuminated something unimaginable, a stone, covered in hoarfrost, that moved as if alive. Yes, and the deer carcass, found earlier, it stood nearby. But now it was moving. Perfectly synchronized. And the snow around it began to melt, as if a living entity was drawing heat from the air. And then the searchers understood the horrific truth: the 5 men didn't just vanish. They had been drawn into this process. Into this forest that breathes. Into this snow that lives. Into this mountain that gathers consciousness. The tracks beneath the snow became enormous, disappearing into the depths. And the air swirled, as if in a vortex. And the mountain could be heard: it whispered, screamed, laughed, cried. And now no one could turn back. And no one yet knew what would happen next. The tracks under the snow vanished, but the forest did not abandon the searchers. It became a living labyrinth, where every trunk, every branch, every snowflake, a threat. Their steps echoed not with an echo, but with a strange breath. And every gaze caught shadows that shouldn't be there. The snow melted faster than anywhere else, revealing strange shapes beneath the surface, depressions, patterns resembling human bodies. And the further they went, the clearer it became that the mountain builds its own world, and man in it, merely a guest, who can be erased with a single breath. And then they saw it, in a small clearing, surrounded by trees, stood a statue of ice and snow. At first they mistook it for a frozen tree. But when the light from their lanterns touched its surface, it moved. And in that movement they recognized the force that took 5 men. The form was human, but everything in it was broken, limbs bent, head tilted unnaturally, body radiating cold and emptiness. And this moment lasted a second, but felt like an eternity. And simultaneously, as if the mountain itself whispered, "You've come too far, they are now a part of me." And then the searchers heard footsteps. Not one person. 5. 5 men. But it wasn't a joyful, alive. These were steps from another world. Steps that didn't touch the snow. Steps that came from the depths of darkness, where no sky was visible, no ground, no light. The light from the lanterns illuminated them. All 5 of them, the missing, looked directly at the searchers. But these weren't eyes. Only emptiness. Only cold. And the first one understood the horror. The 5 men were alive, but they were not human. Their bodies were subservient to the mountain, their minds, a part of this forest, this darkness, this snowfall that remembers everything. And the mountain took their souls, but left their forms to resemble the living. So that terrifying illusions would hold people's attention. So that no one would ever understand what happened. The searchers couldn't step back. The snow under their feet became viscous, like water. And every step was burdened by an invisible weight, as if the mountain itself was pulling them to its center. And when they turned around, the forest was no longer behind them. They understood, the mountain had closed off their world. And a step back, impossible. And even the memory of the way back, vanished. Each heart beat faster, and their breathing became erratic. The snow trembled. The trees bent, as if wanting to touch them. And the ice form glowed with an inner light, as if it saw their fear and rejoiced. And the last scream tore from the searcher's lips when he saw 3 of the 5 missing men stepping towards them, but they were not alive, not human. And the mountain fell silent. The snow stopped falling. And the forest once again became dark, but now dead. The searchers understood, they would not return. And no one else would ever understand what happened. The snow was even again. The tracks vanished. The air was clean. Silence, complete. The 5 men did not leave the forest. They remained there, where man has no power, where mountains breathe, where snow remembers everything. And now this forest, this mountain, this darkness, await the next. In some corners of the country, legends are still told about 5 men who once took a wrong turn and ended up in a place that isn't on any map. A place where the road leads when it stops being a road. A place where the light disappears on its own.